The Browns media's worst nightmare. Oh no, what's going on, Robert Bill? Oh no! Everybody was so afraid that Coach Prime was gonna, the NFL Hall of Famer, he was gonna come in and I guess destroy the Browns facility, rip apart the locker room, they said. But here he is on day 2, and I do want
A man walks onto an NFL practice field. He says nothing to the cameras, and somehow that silence becomes the loudest story in Cleveland. Nobody expected this, not like this, because for weeks, the noise around this Browns team wasn't about routes or coverages or who's winning the backup job. It was about one name, one legacy, one father standing on the sideline of his son's NFL life, and a media machine that couldn't decide if that was a blessing or a threat. This is the story of a young quarterback carrying a heavier last name than almost anyone in football history. A story about pressure that never lets up, about doubt that follows you into rooms you didn't even know you walked into, and about a training camp moment that was supposed to blow up a locker room and instead, quietly, did not. Stay with this one, because what happened next says more about who actually understands football than anyone wants to admit. Let's rewind. Since the moment his name got called on draft day, Shedeur Sanders has never just been a football player. He's been a headline generator, a talking point, a referendum on everything from nepotism to social media culture, to what it means to be young, confident, and black in a league that has always had complicated feelings about all three at once. Some people saw a generational talent, a kid who grew up inside the game, who watched his father redefine an entire position of cool before he was even old enough to understand what a highlight reel was. Other people saw exactly the opposite, a name that opened doors talent might not have, a kid whose confidence to some read less like belief and more like arrogance. And that split, that argument followed him everywhere. It followed him through college. It followed him into every mock draft. It followed him all the way down draft night when team after team passed and cameras stayed locked on his face, waiting for him to break. He didn't. That, right there, is where this story actually starts to get interesting, because most people expected the story to end with the slide. Instead, the slide became the beginning of something else entirely. Think about what that moment really was. A young man sitting in a room with his family, watching pick after pick go by, knowing every single one was a public referendum on his worth. Cameras zoomed in like they were hoping for tears. Analysts filled airtime speculating about makeup issues, about red flags, about whether teams simply didn't trust what they'd heard behind closed doors. And he sat there. He didn't cry. He didn't storm out. He waited. That single image, poised, composed, refusing to give the moment the reaction it was hunting for, became one of the most talked about scenes of the entire draft cycle. Some people called it discipline, some people called it denial, but nobody could deny it was memorable. Fast forward to Cleveland, and here's where the real tension begins, because a rookie quarterback landing on a franchise with this much recent quarterback turmoil isn't just a football story, it's a pressure cooker. The Browns have not exactly been a beacon of stability at the position, and every young arm that walks into that building inherits years of frustration from a fan base that has been burned again and again. So when Shedeur arrived, the questions weren't just about routes and reads, they were about whether he could survive the environment, whether the hype could hold up under real NFL lights, whether this was a young man built for the moment, or a name that had simply outgrown the substance behind it. And then, in the middle of all that noise, his father shows up to practice. Now on paper, that shouldn't be a story at all. A former player, a Hall of Famer, a man who has coached at the highest levels of college football, quietly observing an NFL training camp. That happens all the time around this league. Legends show up, alumni show up, nobody blinks. But this wasn't just any legend. This was Deion Sanders, and the second his presence was confirmed, cameras multiplied like it was a championship parade. Every angle, every reaction shot, every conversation on the sideline dissected like it held some hidden meaning.
I want to point something out, because people say something, and a lot, and I haven't talked about Shedeur's draft slide in a long time because I wanted to be in the past, but y'all lied because y'all said it was all about, the problems that Deion Sanders will create. The problem is we're here a year later. What problems did Deion Sanders create? Go ahead. And now, the second day of the camp, Shedeur getting his first team reps. The Buffs are about to be locked.
Here's the thing people conveniently forgot in that moment. This is a man who redefined what it meant to be a two-way superstar in professional sports. A man who built relationships across locker rooms for decades, long before his son ever put on a helmet. Coaches on that roster had crossed paths with him before Shedeur was even drafted. Veteran players on that roster had history with him that had nothing to do with his son at all. So when he showed up and players lit up around him and the head coach greeted him like an old friend instead of a threat, maybe, just maybe, that wasn't drama. Maybe that was just respect, the kind that gets earned over an entire career, showing up exactly where you'd expect it to. But that's not the story some corners of the media wanted to tell. They wanted disruption. They wanted tension. They wanted a storyline where a proud father becomes a distraction, where a support system becomes a scandal, where a locker room fractures under the weight of outside noise. Instead, what actually happened was almost anticlimactic in the best possible way. A respected coach handled a legendary presence like a professional. A locker room stayed locked in, and a rookie quarterback kept doing what he came there to do: work. That contrast, though, that's where this story really turns, because it forces a bigger question. What if the problem was never Shedeur Sanders at all? What if the problem was never his father, never his confidence, never the size of his last name? Maybe, this whole time, part of the problem was simply bad leadership. Go back to where this young quarterback's rookie year actually started. Go back to the environment he first walked into. There's a very real conversation happening right now among people who watch this league closely. A conversation about the difference between coaching structures that empower young players and coaching structures that quietly undermine them. Under one regime, there were whispers, frustration, moments that felt less like development and more like mishandling. A young player caught in circumstances that didn't seem designed to bring out his best, surrounded by narratives he never asked for, dealing with situations that had very little to do with football at all. Then, leadership changed, and almost immediately, the tone around this team started to shift. People who've been inside that building during the new regime describe something different: a sharper focus, a more intentional atmosphere. Practices that feel less like the first week of training camp and more like a team already chasing something real. Attention to detail. Coaches coaching harder, not softer. An operation that finally feels like it's being run the way an NFL franchise should be run. And in that environment, a legendary football mind walking onto the practice field isn't treated like a threat. It's treated like an opportunity. A chance to talk shop with someone who understands the position, understands the pressure, understands exactly what it takes to survive at this level because he lived it himself for nearly 2 decades. That's not chaos, that's culture. So here's the retention hook worth sitting with for a second, because this is the part people miss. The old narrative said Shedeur Sanders needed to be protected from his own name. The new evidence suggests the opposite. Maybe his name and everything that comes with it was never the liability people made it out to be. Maybe it was always an asset, waiting for a coaching staff secure enough to actually use it. Think about what that means for how this young quarterback is being built right now. Every rep, every walkthrough, every moment on that practice field is happening inside an environment that finally seems designed to develop him instead of just survive him.
I mean, that was a Deion Sanders. You kidding me? Forget that it's Shedeur's dad. I mean, first of all, he did an unbelievable job with Shedeur. Great kid, and obviously an elite football player, help baseball player, and then as a coach, I mean, wow, everything that he's achieved, that was awesome. So yeah.
I mean, I don't know, man. I don't know, man. I guess I don't think this is the reaction.
And that shift matters more than any single headline ever could, because development compounds. A rookie who gets real coaching, real structure, real belief in year one carries that foundation forward in ways that show up 2 years down the line, 3 years down the line, in moments nobody's filming yet. Now, let's talk about the man himself for a second, because it's easy to lose him in all this noise about coaches and fathers and media narratives. What actually stands out about Shedeur Sanders, underneath all the storylines, is how remarkably unbothered he seems by the noise. Not unaware of it, unbothered. There's a difference. He has spent basically his entire life inside a spotlight most people never experience for a single day. Cameras at his high school games, cameras at his college practices, cameras at his father's press conferences, waiting for him in the background before he'd even thrown his first college pass. That kind of exposure either breaks a person, or it forges something close to armor. In everything about how he's carried himself, through the slide, through the criticism, through every hot take questioning his readiness, suggests it built the armor. That's not the same as saying he's finished. Nobody becomes a finished product in a single training camp. There will be growing pains. There will be rough practices, bad throws, moments where the doubters get fresh ammunition and run with it, because that's simply how this league works for every rookie quarterback who has ever existed. But the foundation matters, and right now, the foundation being built around him looks sturdier than almost anyone predicted back on draft night. Here's a moment worth pausing on before we go further, because it's easy to keep scrolling past stories like this without really sitting with them. If this is resonating, this is exactly the kind of honest, no-agenda breakdown worth sticking around for, so go ahead and subscribe now, because there's a lot more of this story still coming. Let's get back into it. Because the bigger picture here isn't really about one practice, or one sideline conversation, or one set of camera angles that got a little too excited about a Hall of Famer showing up to watch his son work. The bigger picture is about what happens when talent finally lands in the right environment. For years, the conversation around this young quarterback was dominated by outside factors: his name, his confidence, his father, the controversy of the slide. All of that noise crowded out the actual football conversation, the one about his instincts, his poise in the pocket, his ability to process a defense quickly, the traits that made him a standout in college in the first place before any of the off-field storylines took over. Now, slowly, that conversation is starting to shift back to where it probably should have been all along, back to the tape, back to the reps, back to how he's actually performing when the cameras stop caring about who's standing on the sideline. And that shift is happening specifically because the environment around him changed. Because instead of chaos, there's structure. Instead of distraction, there's focus. Instead of a coaching staff worried about optics, there's a coaching staff that seems genuinely locked into building a real football operation. One where a legendary presence on the practice field is treated as exactly what it is: a resource, not a threat. That's the turning point in this story. Not a single dramatic moment, not a viral headline. A quiet, steady shift in culture that's easy to miss if you're only watching for fireworks. So what does this actually mean going forward?
They like playing with his name. That's cool. It is what it is. But I'm here to tell you that it looks like things went pretty well. It seems like no drama erupted. It seems like the locker room isn't tearing at the seams. Hey, but I tell you what, Browns media sure did have every angle, boy. Every single angle possible of Deion Sanders. Deion Sanders sitting. Deion Sanders walking. Deion Sanders.
It means the pressure isn't gone. It will never fully be gone. Not for a player with this last name. Not in a market like Cleveland. Not in a league that has already shown it's willing to scrutinize his every move. There will be tough weeks. There will be moments where the doubters resurface louder than ever, because that's the nature of covering a story this big. But it also means something else. It means the foundation being laid right now, the coaching, the structure, the environment, the support system finally being allowed to function the way it's supposed to, gives this story a real chance to end differently than the skeptics predicted. Because at the end of the day, this was never really about whether Deion Sanders showed up to a practice. It was never really about camera angles, or sideline conversations, or which reporter got the best shot of a Hall of Famer watching his son work. It was about whether an organization could finally give a talented young quarterback the environment he actually needed. And 2 days into this new chapter, with no drama, no fractured locker room, and a coaching staff that seems to genuinely understand what it has, the early answer looks a lot more promising than anyone expected. The doubters will still be there. They always are. But for the first time in a long time, the story around Shedeur Sanders isn't being written by outside noise. It's being written on the practice field, one rep at a time. And that, more than anything else, might be the real turning point nobody saw coming. Let's go a little deeper, though, because this story has layers most highlight reels never show you. Think about what it actually takes to grow up as this specific kid inside this specific family. Most young athletes get to fail quietly. They get to throw a bad interception in front of a few hundred people, shake it off, and move on with their week. Shedeur never had that luxury. Every mistake got magnified. Every triumph got dissected for hidden motives. Even his confidence, the thing that should have been celebrated as a strength, got twisted into a character flaw by people who never once considered that maybe, just maybe, it was armor built out of necessity. Growing up around greatness does strange things to a person. It can either crush you under impossible comparisons, or it can teach you how impossible standards actually get met. From everything visible about how he carries himself, it looks a lot more like the second one. He watched his father walk into rooms full of skeptics and simply outwork the doubt. He watched him get written off as too flashy, too confident, too much, and then watched him back it up on the field year after year until the criticism quieted into respect. That's the blueprint this young quarterback inherited. Not just talent, not just a famous last name, a framework for how to survive being underestimated in public over and over again without losing yourself in the process. And that matters more in this next chapter than almost anything else, because the NFL doesn't care about your resume. It doesn't care about your college numbers or your recruiting rankings or how many magazine covers you were on before you turned 22. It cares about whether you can handle a Sunday when nothing goes right, when the offensive line breaks down, when the crowd turns on you, when a single bad read gets replayed 100 times on national television. That kind of pressure breaks players who look unshakable in every other setting. It's the great equalizer of professional football, and it's exactly the test this next stretch of his career is about to become. But here's the part worth sitting with. Pressure isn't new to him. It's been the baseline of his entire life. While other rookies are adjusting to their first real taste of national scrutiny, he's already lived through years of it. The cameras, the criticism, the debate shows dedicating entire segments to whether he deserved to be there at all. None of that is a new experience walking into his first NFL season. It's just a louder version of something he's carried since high school. That doesn't guarantee success. Nothing guarantees success in this league, but it does mean the mental framework is already there in a way it simply isn't for most 20-something-year-olds stepping into a professional locker room for the first time. Now, go back to that practice field for a second, because there's a smaller moment buried in all this noise that says more than people realize.
They're witnessing what's happening. They can see a night and day difference. They've been saying that since OTAs. And now 2 days in the training camp, Coach Prime's there, no drama, no media, none of these, the locker room hasn't fallen apart. Maybe some head coaches can handle it and some can't. Maybe the Browns media isn't used to having a coach that can handle.
Picture a rookie quarterback out early, putting in extra work with his teammates, not for the cameras, not for a highlight package, just because that's what the job requires. Veteran receivers running routes alongside him, a legendary former player watching from the sideline, not interfering, not coaching, just present. That's not a distraction. That's what development is actually supposed to look like when nobody's performing for an audience. Compare that image to the one the outside noise tried to sell for weeks. A father supposedly hovering, a locker room supposedly on edge, a situation supposedly one bad headline away from imploding. None of that matched what was actually happening on the ground, and that gap between the story being sold and the reality being lived is where this whole narrative starts to unravel for anyone paying close attention. It also raises an uncomfortable question about why that gap existed in the first place. Why was there so much appetite for chaos around this particular young man? Why did a supportive father showing up to watch practice become a multi-camera event instead of a footnote? Some of it is simple math. Recognizable names generate clicks, and few names in football carry more recognition than this one. But some of it runs deeper than algorithms and headlines. It's a reflection of how differently confidence gets read depending on who's carrying it. How quickly composure gets mistaken for arrogance. How easily a young man can get cast as a problem before he's ever given a real chance to prove otherwise. That's not a comfortable conversation, but it's an honest one, and it's impossible to talk about this story without acknowledging it sits right underneath the surface. So where does that leave things heading into the rest of this season? It leaves a young quarterback with something he hasn't had in a while, an environment that seems built to let him actually be evaluated on football rather than everything orbiting around it. Coaching that appears intentional instead of reactive, a staff that treats a Hall of Fame presence on the practice field as a resource instead of a headline risk. Veteran teammates who already have relationships and respect built with the people around him instead of walking in cold and skeptical. None of that guarantees a Pro Bowl season. It doesn't guarantee anything, honestly, because football rarely hands out guarantees to anyone, let alone a rookie navigating the steepest learning curve in professional sports. There will be interceptions that get overanalyzed. There will be weeks where the offense stalls and his name becomes the easiest target in the post-game breakdown. That's simply the reality of the job, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. But what this moment does offer is something that's been missing from his story for a long time. A fair shot. Not a guaranteed outcome, just a fair, honest opportunity to develop inside a structure that isn't working against him. And for a young man who has spent his entire life being judged before he ever got the chance to prove anything, that alone might be the most significant turning point of all. So keep watching this one closely, not because of what happened on a random Tuesday practice with extra camera angles and a proud father standing off to the side. Watch it because of what that moment revealed. A locker room that didn't crack, a coaching staff that didn't panic, and a young quarterback who just kept working, like none of the noise ever mattered in the first place. Because in the end, that's usually how the real stories get written, not in the headlines chasing drama, in the quiet, repetitive, unglamorous work that happens long before anyone's paying attention. The kind of work that, given enough time, has a way of proving every doubter wrong.